The freight wagon lurched to a violent stop beside the weathered trading post, its wheels grinding against the packed earth with a sound like breaking bones. Dust billowed around the vehicle as passengers began climbing down, most greeted by waiting relatives or business associates who had traveled from the nearby settlements. But one figure remained hunched in the wagon's corner, her thin frame wrapped in a threadbare shawl that had once been blue but was now the color of ash. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell clutched a small canvas bag to her chest, the sum total of her worldly possessions. Inside were 3 items: a bent tin cup, a photograph of her parents taken before the consumption claimed them both, and a letter from the bank in St. Louis informing her that the family farm had been sold for taxes. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago. She'd been traveling ever since, using the last of her money for passage west, chasing rumors of work in the territories. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Holbrook, who had shown her kindness during the 3-day journey, turned in his seat. "End of the line, miss. This here's Cedar Junction. Last stop before the mountain passes close for winter." Sarah nodded but made no move to descend. Through the wagon's canvas opening she could see Cedar Junction in its entirety, a handful of rough-hewn buildings scattered along a dusty main road that seemed to lead nowhere. A trading post with a false front that fooled no one. A blacksmith shop where smoke rose lazily from the forge. A saloon that had seen better decades. And beyond it all, the imposing wall of the Rocky Mountains, their peaks already dusted with October snow that promised an early winter. "You got people meeting you?" Holbrook asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah shook her head, unable to meet his eyes. The shame of her situation burned in her chest like a physical weight. 6 months ago she had been the daughter of prosperous farmers, engaged to marry the banker's son, secure in a future that seemed as solid as the Missouri soil her family had worked for 3 generations. Now she was a refugee from debt and death, carrying nothing but hope that had grown thinner with each mile traveled. "Well," Holbrook said gently, "I reckon the trading post might have work. Mrs. Garrett runs it, fair woman, from what I hear. Might. Need help with the cooking or cleaning?" Sarah finally climbed down from the wagon, her legs unsteady after days of travel. The October air bit through her worn dress, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow. Around her, the other passengers retrieved their belongings and dispersed into the settlement, leaving her standing alone beside the wagon as Holbrook unloaded supplies for the trading post. The canvas bag felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she approached the trading post's front door. Through the grimy window, she could see shelves lined with goods: coffee, flour, ammunition, tools, things that represented security and preparation for the challenges ahead. Things she could never afford. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. This was clearly Mrs. Garrett, and her expression as she took in Sarah's appearance was not encouraging. "Help you?" The woman's voice carried the flat pragmatism of someone who had seen too many desperate souls pass through her establishment. "I'm looking for work," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything. Cooking, cleaning, tending store. I can work hard." Mrs. Garrett's gaze swept over Sarah's thin frame, the patches on her dress, the desperation poorly hidden behind her. Attempt at dignity. "Experience? I ran my family's household for 2 years after my mother took sick. I can cook for large groups, manage accounts, tend the sick." References. Sarah's heart sank. "My family's gone. The farm was sold. I have a letter from our pastor in St. Louis, but it doesn't help you here," Mrs. Garrett finished. She studied Sarah for another long moment. "I've got a girl already. Business isn't good enough for 2. Winter's coming, and most folks have already laid in their supplies." The door closed. With a soft click that sounded like finality, Sarah stood on the wooden porch, fighting back tears that would accomplish nothing. Behind her she heard Holbrook securing his freight wagon for the night. Soon he would be heading back east, and her last connection to civilization would disappear over the horizon. The settlement offered few other possibilities. The blacksmith was a one-man operation. The saloon would have work, but Sarah knew the nature of that employment, and desperation hadn't yet driven her to such measures. A few scattered cabins housed families who were clearly struggling themselves, judging by the patches on their children's clothing and the thin wisps of smoke from their chimneys. As evening approached, the October air grew sharper. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter and walked to the edge of the settlement, where the road continued west into the mountains. According to Holbrook, the next trading post was 40 miles through dangerous country. Impossible to reach on foot, especially with winter threatening. She found herself standing beside a small creek that ran behind the blacksmith's shop, its water clear and cold. Willow trees drooped their branches toward the surface, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the haunting call of a loon. It was a beautiful country, the kind of place she might have appreciated under different circumstances. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her turn. A man approached from the direction of the trading post. Tall, perhaps 30 years old, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen hard use, and a cavalry saber hung at his side, though he bore no other military insignia. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his eyes held a wariness that spoke of hard-won experience. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was soft, with a slight drawl that suggested origins somewhere south of Missouri. Sarah nodded in return, unsure of his intentions. In her experience, men who approached solitary women at dusk rarely had honorable purposes. "Name's Daniel Hawthorne," he continued. "Couldn't help but notice you speaking with Mrs. Garrett. Looking for work?" "I was," Sarah replied carefully, "without success." Daniel studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she wanted to reveal. "Winter's coming hard this year. Already snowed twice in the high country. This isn't a place to be caught without shelter." "I'm aware of that." The words came out sharper than she intended, pride flaring despite her circumstances. Daniel's expression didn't change. Didn't mean any offense, just stating fact. "These mountains don't forgive mistakes." He paused, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. When he spoke again, his words were measured, as if each one carried weight. "I've got a place up in the mountains. Small valley, good water, sheltered from the worst weather. Could use someone to tend it while I'm away on scout duty." Sarah stared at him, uncertain she had heard correctly. "You're offering me work?" "Offering you survival," Daniel corrected. "Work would be part of it. Valley needs watching, cabin needs maintaining, garden needs preparing for spring. In exchange, you'd have shelter, food, safety through the winter." It seemed too good to be true, which, in Sarah's experience, meant it probably was. "What's the arrangement? What would you expect in return?" Daniel's face remained neutral. "What I said. Tend the place. Keep it ready for when I return. Nothing more, nothing less." "And when do you return?" "Spring, mostly. Sometimes sooner if the weather breaks or if the army doesn't need scouting services. Depends on Indian activity, supply routes, a dozen other factors." Sarah felt a surge of suspicion. "Why would you trust a stranger with your property?" "Because," Daniel said simply, "you've got the look of someone who's lost everything and knows the value of what remains. Those kinds of people don't steal or destroy. They protect what they're given." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Sarah had indeed lost everything: family, home, future, the entire life she had planned and worked toward. But something in Daniel's manner, suggested he understood that loss in ways that went beyond mere observation. "Where is this valley?" she asked. Daniel pointed toward the mountains, where the last light of day was painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. "Ah, 2 days' ride northwest, hidden canyon that most folks never find. Good hunting, clean water, soil that grows vegetables even at altitude. Been in my family for 15 years. Your family? My father found it during the war. Mexican conflict. He was cavalry too, scouting for General Kearney. After the fighting ended, he settled there with my mother, built the cabin, started the garden. They're both gone now." There was a story in those few words, Sarah realized. Pain carefully controlled, grief transformed into practical action. She recognized the pattern because she was living it herself. "Why aren't you staying there yourself?" Daniel's smile was brief and held no humor. "Army pays better than farming. Valley's good for one person, but not profitable enough for a man to make a living. Scout work keeps me fed and equipped, and the valley stays ready for when I need." The arrangement made sense from a practical standpoint, but Sarah had learned to be wary of arrangements that seemed too convenient. "What aren't you telling me?" Daniel respected the directness of the question. "Valley's isolated. No neighbors for 20 miles in any direction. No law except what you make yourself. If something happened, accident, sickness, trouble of any kind, you'd be on your own. Until spring. What kind of trouble? The usual. Bears, mountain lions, weather that can kill you if you're not prepared. Sometimes drifters are looking for easy pickings. Sometimes Indians, though the local tribes are mostly peaceful if you don't give them reason otherwise." Sarah absorbed this information. The risks were real, but they weren't necessarily worse than the certainty of freezing or starving in Cedar Junction. At least in the valley, she would have shelter and the possibility of survival. "When would we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. Storms coming in from the northwest, can smell it in the air, want to be in the valley before it hits." The decision felt simultaneously momentous and inevitable. Sarah had reached the end of her options, and Daniel Hawthorne represented the only path forward that didn't lead to certain disaster. "I accept," she said. Daniel nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Good. Meet me at the trading post at first light. Bring whatever you have, but travel light. Mountain trails aren't forgiving to heavy loads." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "Mr. Hawthorne, why are you doing this?" Daniel paused, his silhouette dark against the evening sky. "Everyone deserves a chance to survive their worst winter. Valley's been good to my family. Maybe it'll be good to you too." With that, he disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Sarah alone beside the creek with the weight of her decision. She had just agreed to follow a stranger into the wilderness, to spend the winter in complete isolation, trusting her survival to a man she had known for all of 20 minutes. But as she made her way back toward the trading post, where she hoped to negotiate a place to sleep for one final night, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, built on nothing more than the word of a cavalry scout and the promise of a hidden valley. But it was more than she had possessed when the freight wagon had deposited her in Cedar Junction. That night, she slept in the trading post's back room on a makeshift bed of grain sacks, courtesy of Mrs. Garrett's grudging charity. Through the thin walls, she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the windows and moaning through the gaps in the building's construction. Daniel had been right about the approaching storm. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been planning her wedding, choosing fabrics for her dress, discussing the details of a life that had seemed as solid and predictable as sunrise. Then came her father's cough that wouldn't heal, followed by her mother's. The doctor's visits that drained their savings, the failed harvest that left them unable to pay the mounting debts, the slow, agonizing process of watching everything they had built crumble into dust. The bank had been patient at first, then insistent, then ruthless. The sale of the farm had barely covered the debts, leaving Sarah with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that somewhere, in the vast Western Territories, she might find a place to start over. Now, incredibly, that place might exist. A hidden valley where she could spend the winter in safety, where she could plan and prepare for whatever came next. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was life itself, and that was more than she had dared hope for when the freight wagon reached Cedar Junction. Outside, the wind continued to rise, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter's early arrival. Sarah pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, new tests of her ability to adapt and survive. But for the first time in months, tomorrow also brought possibility. Dawn arrived grey and cold, with snowflakes dancing in the air like harbingers of the storm Daniel had predicted. Sarah was waiting outside the trading post with her meager possessions when he appeared, leading 2 horses through the early morning mist. The horses were clearly mountain-bred, sturdy, sure-footed animals, with thick coats already growing in for winter. Daniel had loaded one with supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition, tools, and other necessities for surviving in isolation. The other, a gentle-looking mare with intelligent eyes, was clearly intended for Sarah. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You ride?" Daniel asked, adjusting the mare's stirrups to accommodate Sarah's shorter legs. "Some," Sarah replied, though it had been years since she had been on horseback. Farm work had left little time for recreational riding. Daniel must have sensed her uncertainty because he spent several minutes reviewing the basics: how to sit, how to guide the animal, how to maintain her balance on uncertain terrain. His manner was patient and instructive, without condescension or impatience. "Her name's Melody," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's got a mountain sense. Trust her judgment, and she'll keep you safe." As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Garrett emerged from the trading post to watch their preparations. Her expression remained skeptical, but she approached Sarah with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Jerky and hardtack," she said gruffly, "case you get hungry on the trail." The unexpected kindness caught Sarah off guard. "Thank you. I hope someday I can repay your generosity." Mrs. Garrett's weathered face softened slightly. "Just survive the winter, girl. That'll be enough payment." Daniel mounted his horse, a powerful stallion that stood perfectly still, despite its obvious eagerness to be moving. "Ready?" Sarah nodded, though she felt anything but ready. The unknown stretched ahead of her like an uncharted ocean, and she was about to launch herself into it with nothing but faith in a stranger's promise and her own determination to survive. They rode out of Cedar Junction as the first serious snowflakes began to fall, heading northwest into a country that grew wilder and more remote with each mile. Behind them, the small settlement quickly disappeared into the mist and snow, taking with it Sarah's last connection to the world she had known. Ahead lay the mountains, and somewhere among their peaks and valleys, a place that might become her salvation, if she proved strong enough to claim it. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, their branches heavy with accumulating snow that muffled the sound of the horses' hooves on the rocky ground. Sarah gripped Melody's reins with numb fingers, her thin gloves providing little protection against the October cold. The mare moved with sure-footed confidence along paths that seemed barely wide enough for a man on foot, let alone mounted riders with pack animals. Daniel rode ahead, his posture relaxed despite the treacherous terrain. He seemed to know every rock, every turn, every place where the trail narrowed to barely passable width. Occasionally he would raise his hand in warning, signaling Sarah to give her horse more rein or to lean away from a drop-off that plunged into mist-shrouded depths. They had been climbing for 3 hours when Daniel called a halt beside a small stream that tumbled down from the heights above. The water ran clear and cold, and both horses drank eagerly while their riders dismounted to stretch cramped muscles. "How much farther?" Sarah asked, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The temperature had dropped steadily as they gained elevation, and she was beginning to understand why Daniel had emphasized the urgency of reaching shelter before the storm fully arrived. "Half-day's ride, if the weather holds," Daniel replied, checking the loads on his pack horse. "Trail gets rougher from here, follows an old Indian hunting path that wasn't meant for regular travel." Sarah looked back down the mountainside, where Cedar Junction had long since vanished into the swirling snow. The world below seemed impossibly far away, as if they had climbed into another realm entirely. "Do you make this journey often?" 3-4 times a year, spring when the snow melts enough to get through, summer to tend the garden and make repairs, fall to prepare for winter, sometimes in between if army business brings me this direction. Daniel's answers were economical, revealing little about his thoughts or feelings. Sarah had noticed this pattern during their morning's travel. He spoke when necessary, offered information that served practical purposes, but volunteered nothing personal, beyond what circumstances required. It was the behavior of a man accustomed to solitude, she realized, someone who had learned to guard his words as carefully as his possessions. "What kind of scouting do you do for the army?" she asked, curious about the man who had offered her salvation. Daniel was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested difficult memories. Track movement through the territories. Indians mostly, but also bandits, smugglers, anyone who might threaten supply lines or settlements. Map new routes. When the old ones become impassable, sometimes carry messages between outposts when regular communication fails. Dangerous work. All work's dangerous out here. Question is whether you're risking your life for something worthwhile. Sarah studied his profile as he adjusted his horse's bridle. Daniel Hawthorne was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His features were too weathered, his expression too guarded, his manner too spare for easy charm. But there was something compelling about his quiet competence, his obvious familiarity with a world that seemed impossibly hostile to someone like her. "Why did you choose that life?" she asked. Daniel mounted his horse before answering, and when he did, his words came slowly, as if drawn from some deep well of consideration. "Didn't choose it exactly, more like it chose me. After my parents died, the valley wasn't enough to support a man on its own. Army offered steady pay, and the work suited my nature. I'm comfortable with solitude, good at reading sign, better with horses than with people." The last comment carried a hint of self-deprecation that made Sarah smile despite her circumstances. "You seem to manage well enough with people. Present company accepted," Daniel replied, and she caught the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They continued climbing as the storm intensified around them. The wind howled through the pine boughs overhead, sending cascades of snow tumbling from the branches. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow, marked more by Daniel's instinctive knowledge than by any visible path. Sarah found herself studying the man who rode ahead of her, trying to understand the motivations behind his unexpected generosity. In her experience, men who offered help to desperate women usually expected payment of one kind or another. But Daniel's manner suggested no hidden agenda, no expectation beyond the practical arrangement he had described. Perhaps it was his obvious familiarity with loss, she thought. He had mentioned his parents' deaths with the careful neutrality of someone who had made peace with grief, but still carried its weight. Maybe he recognized in her situation an echo of his own difficulties and was offering the kind of help he might have wished for during his own time of need. The trail turned sharply to the right, following the contour of a steep cliff face. Below them, Sarah could see a narrow valley filled with mist and snow, its floor invisible through the storm. Above them, granite peaks thrust toward the leaden sky like the ramparts of some impossible fortress. "Beautiful country," she said, genuinely struck by the wild grandeur of the landscape. "Beautiful and deadly," Daniel agreed. "These mountains have killed more men than all the Indian wars combined. Weather, altitude, simple carelessness. Doesn't take much for the high country to claim you. Yet you choose to live here." Daniel considered this, chose to survive here. Different thing. These mountains test you every day, but they're honest about it. You know the rules, and if you follow them, you can make a life, easier than dealing with people, most times. Sarah understood the sentiment. The civilized world she had known, with its banks and debts and social expectations, had proven just as deadly to her family's welfare as any mountain storm. At least here, the dangers were visible and direct, rather than hidden behind legal documents and polite conversation. The path began to level somewhat, though they were still climbing. Daniel pointed ahead to where the trail disappeared around a massive boulder formation. Valley entrance is just beyond that outcrop, hidden so well that most folks ride right past without seeing it. Sure enough, when they rounded the rocks, Sarah saw what appeared to be a solid wall of granite rising before them. But as they approached more closely, she realized that what looked like solid stone was actually a narrow gap between two cliff faces, an opening barely wide enough for a horse and rider to pass through single file. "My father called it the Needles." "Aye," Daniel explained as he dismounted to lead his horse through the opening. "Only way in or out of the valley, unless you're part mountain goat." Sarah followed his example, walking beside Melody through the narrow passage. The walls rose on either side, creating a natural tunnel perhaps 30 feet long. At its far end, she could see daylight, though the storm made it difficult to distinguish details of what lay beyond. When they emerged from the passage, Sarah stopped in wonder despite the cold and snow swirling around them. The hidden valley spread before her like something from a storybook, a perfect oval of level ground, perhaps half a mile across, surrounded on all sides by towering cliff walls that created a natural amphitheater. A stream wandered through the center of the valley floor, its banks lined with willows and cottonwoods. Even through the storm, she could see the geometric lines of a vegetable garden and the dark silhouette of a cabin nestled against the far wall of the valley. "It's incredible," she breathed, momentarily forgetting the cold. Daniel remounted his horse, but she noticed he was watching her reaction rather than the valley itself. "My father spent 2 years looking for a place like this, somewhere defensible, with good water and soil, protected from the worst weather. Found it purely by accident while tracking a wounded elk." They rode across the valley floor toward the cabin, and with each step, Sarah felt her amazement growing. The place was indeed everything Daniel had promised, isolated but not barren, protected but not imprisoned. Even in the midst of the storm, she could sense the valley's potential for supporting life. The cabin proved to be larger than it had appeared from a distance, built from logs that had been carefully chinked and sealed against mountain weather. A stone chimney rose from one end, and a covered porch extended across the front, providing shelter for firewood and tools. Behind the main structure, she could see a small barn and what appeared to be a root cellar dug into the hillside. Daniel helped her dismount, then began unloading the pack animals with practiced efficiency. "Get inside and start a fire," he instructed. "I'll tend the horses and secure the supplies." Firewood stacked on the porch, kindling in the box beside the fireplace. Sarah approached the cabin door with a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. This place would be her home for the next 6 months, assuming she proved capable of surviving mountain winter. Everything about her future depended on what lay beyond that heavy wooden door. The interior exceeded her expectations. The main room was larger than many houses she had known, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows that would provide ample light during daylight hours. The furniture was simple but well made, a table and chairs crafted from pine, shelves lined with books and supplies, a comfortable-looking chair positioned near the fireplace. A ladder led to a loft area that served as the bedroom, while a doorway at the back of the cabin opened into what was clearly a kitchen and pantry area. Everything was clean and well-maintained, as if someone had been caring for the place despite Daniel's long absences. Sarah found the firewood and kindling exactly where Daniel had indicated. The fireplace was already laid with paper and small sticks, needing only a match to bring it to life. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, beginning to drive the chill from the air. Daniel entered carrying the first load of supplies, stamping snow from his boots before crossing the threshold. "Fire's good," he observed with approval. "Now we need to get everything inside before this storm gets worse." They worked together for the next hour, transferring supplies from the pack animals to the cabin's storage areas. Sarah was impressed by the extent of Daniel's preparations: flour, coffee, beans, preserved meat, ammunition, tools, medical supplies, even books and writing materials. It was clear he had been planning this arrangement carefully, ensuring she would have everything necessary for extended isolation. "You've thought of everything," she said, as they stacked the last of the supplies in the pantry. Daniel shrugged. "Learned from experience. Mountains don't forgive poor planning." The horses had been unsaddled and settled in the barn with feed and shelter. Now Daniel turned his attention to the cabin itself, checking window latches, examining the roof beams for signs of stress, ensuring that everything was secure against the storm raging outside. "Storm should blow itself out by tomorrow morning," he said, reading something in the wind's voice that Sarah couldn't interpret. "Good thing we made it when we did. Another hour on the trail and we might have been in real trouble." As evening approached, they prepared their first meal together in the valley. Daniel proved surprisingly competent in the kitchen, while Sarah contributed what skills she had learned managing her family's household. The result was a simple but satisfying dinner of beans, bacon, and coffee that tasted impossibly good. After the day's cold journey, they ate in comfortable silence, both exhausted by the travel and the emotional weight of the day's changes. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, warmth and security created a sanctuary that felt almost luxurious after Sarah's recent experiences. "Tell me about the valley," Sarah said as they finished eating. "How long has your family owned it?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. 15 years, near as I can calculate. My father filed a claim with the territorial government, though I'm not sure how legal it is. Land this remote. Claims get complicated. But no one's ever challenged it, and we've improved it enough to establish clear possession. What happened to your parents?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Daniel answered. "Fever, 3 years ago, swept through the territory. That winter killed dozens of folks. They were both gone within a week of each other." His voice remained steady, but Sarah caught the carefully controlled grief beneath his words. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." "Was and wasn't," Daniel replied honestly. "They were good people, but the isolation was hard on them, especially my mother. She missed civilized company, churches, the kind of community life she'd known back east. By the end, I think they were both ready to rest." Sarah understood that sentiment. Her own parents had fought their final illness with diminishing strength, as if some part of them had accepted the inevitable and was simply waiting for permission to surrender. "What about you?" Daniel asked. "What brought you west? With nothing but a canvas bag and hope?" Sarah found herself telling him the story she had revealed to no one during her weeks of travel. The gradual decline of her family's fortunes, the mounting medical bills as her parents fought consumption, the failed harvest that destroyed their last hope of financial recovery. The bank's patient politeness gradually transformed into legal action. The auction that sold everything they had built to satisfy debts that seemed to multiply faster than they could be paid. Engaged to be married, she concluded. Thomas Bradford, the banker's son. He promised to stand by me through the difficulties, but when the dust settled and I had nothing left to offer, his promises proved less solid than his father's loan documents. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. Man who abandons his obligations because of circumstances isn't much of a man. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was simply being practical. A banker's son needs a wife who can contribute to his social standing, not one who brings nothing but debt and scandal. Scandal. Sarah's laugh was bitter. In polite society, losing everything your family worked 3 generations to build is scandalous. Suggests poor judgment, moral failing, lack of proper character. People prefer to believe that disaster only strikes those who deserve it. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of personal experience. People believe that because it makes them feel safe. Easier to think that bad things happen to bad people than to accept that life can destroy anyone, regardless of their worth or efforts. The understanding in his voice told Sarah that Daniel Hawthorne had faced his own share of judgment and condemnation. Perhaps that explained his willingness to help her, recognition of a fellow survivor of circumstances beyond their control. "What will you do in the spring?" he asked. "When the pass is open and you're free to leave?" Sarah considered the question. "I don't know. I suppose that depends partly on what happens during the winter. Whether I prove capable of managing on my own, whether I can use this time to plan for whatever comes next." "You'll manage," Daniel said with quiet confidence. "Anyone strong enough to survive what you've already been through can handle mountain winter." The certainty in his voice surprised her. "How can you be sure?" "Because you're here. Because when everything else failed, you kept moving forward. Because you accepted help when it was offered instead of letting pride destroy your last chance." Daniel met her eyes across the table. "Those are survival traits. The mountains will test them, but they won't break them." Later, as they prepared for sleep, Daniel showed Sarah how to bank the fire for maximum heat with minimum consumption of fuel. He explained the locations of emergency supplies, the procedures for dealing with various problems that might arise, the signs that would indicate serious weather developing. "I'll leave the day after tomorrow," he said, as he spread his bedroll on the floor near the fireplace. "Army's expecting me at Fort Collins by the end of the week. From there, assignment could take me anywhere in the territory." The prospect of his departure created an unexpected pang of anxiety in Sarah's chest. She had grown accustomed to his steady presence during their day of travel, his quiet competence and obvious knowledge of survival in this harsh environment. Soon she would be alone in the valley with only her own resources to depend upon. "You'll be fine," Daniel said, as if reading her thoughts. "Valley's got everything you need. Trust your instincts and don't take unnecessary risks." Sarah climbed the ladder to the loft area that would serve as her bedroom. The space was smaller than her room back in Missouri, but it was clean and warm, with a comfortable bed and sufficient storage for her few possessions. Through a small window, she could see snow continuing to fall in the valley, but the storm's fury seemed to be diminishing. As she settled under the heavy quilts that would keep her warm through the mountain night, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in her life during the past 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a desperate woman, facing a certain disaster in a remote trading post. Tonight she was warm and fed in a hidden valley with shelter and supplies enough to survive the winter, all because a quiet cavalry scout had recognized something in her situation that prompted him to offer help without expectation of personal gain. The kindness seemed almost miraculous after months of encountering only indifference or exploitation from the people she had met during her westward journey. But was it truly kindness, or simply the practical calculation of a man who needed someone to tend his property during his absence? Sarah wasn't certain it mattered. Whatever Daniel's motivations, the result was the same. She had been given a chance to survive, to plan, to rebuild her life from the foundations up. The responsibility was both daunting and liberating. For the first time since her parents' deaths, her future depended entirely on her own efforts, rather than on the decisions of banks, lawyers, or men who measured her worth by her financial assets. If she succeeded in mastering the challenges of mountain winter, she would emerge in spring with confidence and skills that no one could take away from her. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the valley, but Sarah felt no fear. The cabin was solid, the walls thick, the roof strong enough to bear whatever weight of snow the storm might deposit. Daniel had chosen his refuge well, and now it was hers to defend and maintain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she began learning the routines and requirements of her temporary home. But tonight, for the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell fell asleep feeling secure in her shelter and hopeful about her prospects for survival. Sarah woke to silence so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the valley wrapped in pristine snow that reflected the early morning light like scattered diamonds. From her loft window, she could see the entire hidden sanctuary spread below, transformed into a winter wonderland that took her breath away. Below, she heard Daniel moving about the cabin, the soft sounds of someone trying not to wake a sleeping household. Sarah dressed quickly in the cold air and climbed down to find him building up the fire and preparing coffee with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to early mornings. "Sleep well?" he asked without turning from his work. "Better than I have in months," Sarah admitted, surprised by the truth of it. Despite everything, the uncertainty, the isolation, the daunting prospect of spending winter alone in the mountains, she had slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time since leaving Missouri. Daniel handed her a cup of steaming coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Good. Today I'll show you how everything works. Tomorrow I leave for Fort Collins." The reminder of his impending departure sent an unexpected jolt through Sarah's chest. She had known this moment would come, but one day in his company had made her realize how much she had come to depend on his calm presence and obvious competence. They spent the morning touring the valley's facilities. Daniel showed her the barn, where a milk cow named Bessie waited patiently for her morning milking, along with a small flock of chickens that had somehow survived the storm with their characteristic optimism intact. Behind the cabin, a root cellar had been carved into the hillside, its interior packed with preserved vegetables, smoked meat, and other supplies that would sustain her through the winter months. "My mother's work, mostly," Daniel explained as they examined the neat rows of preserved goods. "She understood better than my father how to prepare for extended isolation. These stores should last until spring, assuming you're careful with portions." The garden, now buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, occupied a large plot near the stream. Daniel pointed out the irrigation channels his father had dug, the cold frames that would protect early plants from late freezes, the careful placement that maximized sunlight while providing shelter from harsh winds. "Come spring, you'll want to start the seed beds early," he said. "Mountain growing season is short. Every day counts when you're trying to produce enough food to last the winter." Sarah absorbed the information, filing away details that might mean the difference between abundance and starvation in the months ahead. The responsibility of maintaining this carefully balanced ecosystem felt overwhelming, but Daniel's matter-of-fact instructions made the task seem manageable rather than impossible. Near the stream, he showed her the fish trap his father had constructed, a clever arrangement of stones and woven branches that funneled trout into a holding pool where they could be caught with relative ease. Even in winter, the trap would provide fresh protein to supplement their preserved stores. Water never freezes completely, Daniel explained. Stream comes from hot springs up in the rocks, keeps flowing even when everything else is locked in. Ice. As they walked back toward the cabin, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. Near the edge of the valley, partially concealed by a stand of aspens, were the remains of what appeared to be another structure. Stone foundations and scattered timber that suggested a building had once stood there. "What was that?" she asked, pointing toward the ruins. Daniel's expression darkened slightly. "My father's first cabin. He built it there when they first arrived, before he understood the valley's patterns. Wrong location. Caught every wind that came through the gap. Impossible to heat effectively. He tore it down and built the current cabin in a more sheltered spot." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Sarah didn't press. Everyone had memories they preferred not to examine too closely. The afternoon was devoted to practical instruction. Daniel taught her how to split firewood properly, how to maintain the fire for maximum efficiency, how to care for the animals and preserve their health through the winter months. He showed her the signals that would indicate dangerous weather approaching, the preparations she should make for serious storms, the procedures for dealing with emergencies when help was impossible to summon. "Most important thing is to avoid taking unnecessary risks," he emphasized as they stacked firewood on the cabin's porch. "If something seems dangerous, it probably is. Better to go without than to get yourself killed trying to prove you're capable." "What about necessary risks?" Sarah asked. "Surely there will be situations where I have no choice but to act, regardless of danger." Daniel considered this. "Fire? Serious injury? Threat to the animals that provide your survival? Yes, those require action. But most situations can be managed with patience and common sense. The valley's been providing for people for 15 years. It knows how to take care of those who treat it with respect." As evening approached, they prepared what would be their final meal together. Sarah had volunteered to cook, wanting to demonstrate that she could manage the domestic responsibilities that would fall to her during Daniel's absence. She prepared a simple but hearty stew from preserved vegetables and dried meat, serving it with bread she had baked in the cabin's efficient oven. "You're a good cook," Daniel observed as they ate. "Better than my mother, truth be told." She was. Too impatient with the process, always wanting to rush things along. The compliment warmed Sarah more than it should have. "I learned from necessity. When my mother became too ill to manage the household, the responsibility fell to me. Feeding a family teaches you to make the most of available ingredients. Useful skill in the mountains. Sometimes you have to create meals from whatever's available, regardless of whether it matches your original plans." After dinner, they sat before the fire while Daniel reviewed the written instructions he had prepared, detailed notes about the valley's routines, seasonal changes she should expect, warning signs that might indicate various problems. His handwriting was careful and precise, every word chosen for maximum clarity. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said, handing her the notebook. "If something happens and you can't remember the procedures, everything's written down, including directions to Fort Collins, in case you need to summon help." The prospect of being truly alone, of facing whatever challenges the winter might bring without Daniel's steady presence, created a hollow feeling in Sarah's chest. But she forced herself to nod calmly, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'll be fine," she said. "You've prepared me well." Daniel studied her face in the firelight. "You're scared," he observed without judgment. Sarah considered, denying it, then decided honesty served better than false bravado. "Terrified," she admitted. "I've never been entirely responsible for my own survival, especially in country this remote. What if I make a mistake? What if something happens that isn't covered in your instructions? Then you'll figure it out," Daniel said with quiet certainty. "Same way you figured out how to survive losing everything you'd built in Missouri. Same way you figured out how to get yourself across half the country with no money and no connections. People are more resilient than they imagine, especially when they have no choice but to succeed." His faith in her abilities was both comforting and daunting. Sarah wanted to live up to his expectations, but she also feared disappointing the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "Will you be back before spring?" she asked. "Depends. On army business. If the Indians stay quiet and the weather cooperates, I might make it back by late February or early March. If there's trouble, could be later." Daniel paused, seeming to wrestle with something he wanted to say. "If I don't, return by April. Don't wait for me. Take whatever you need and head for Fort Collins. The army will help you find passage east or work if you decide to stay in the territory." The possibility that he might not return at all was something Sarah hadn't allowed herself to consider. Daniel's work was dangerous, she understood that, but the abstract knowledge was different from the concrete realization that she might never see him again. "Is your work really that hazardous?" she asked. Daniel's smile was grim. "Scouting means going places where civilized folks don't venture, dealing with people who may not appreciate your presence. Sometimes you ride into situations that don't have peaceful solutions. Have you ever killed anyone?" The question hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they had discussed. Sarah immediately regretted asking, but Daniel answered without hesitation. "Yes," he said simply, "when I had no choice. When it was them or me, or them or innocent people I was sworn to protect." "Does it bother you?" Daniel stared into the fire for a long moment before responding. "It should, and it does. The day killing stops bothering a man is the day he stops being human, but I've made peace with it. Sometimes violence is the only language that prevents greater violence." Sarah understood. The world could be a harsh place, especially on the frontier where law was often miles away and justice depended on individual courage rather than institutional protection. Daniel had found himself in situations where moral abstractions yielded to immediate necessities, and he had done what survival required. "I'm sorry you've had to face such choices," she said. "Part of the life I chose. Man who carries a gun for a living can't pretend he'll never have to use it." Daniel met her eyes. "But you don't need to worry about such things here. The valley's isolated enough that trouble rarely finds it. Most dangerous thing you're likely to face is a bear looking for easy food. And they're mostly asleep this time of year." They talked late into the evening, covering practical matters, but also sharing stories about their pasts, their hopes for the future, their thoughts about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Sarah found herself increasingly comfortable with Daniel's quiet manner, his thoughtful responses to her questions, his obvious respect for her intelligence and capabilities. When they finally prepared for sleep, Daniel lingered near the foot of the ladder leading to Sarah's loft. "I want you to know," he said carefully, "this arrangement isn't charity. You're providing a genuine service by tending the valley. Don't let anyone, including yourself, suggest otherwise." Sarah nodded, understanding the importance of maintaining her dignity even in circumstances that might appear one-sided. "Thank you for that, and thank you for giving me a chance when no one else would." "Everyone deserves a chance to start over," Daniel replied. "Sometimes it just takes finding the right place and the right moment." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with brilliant sunshine turning the snow-covered valley into a dazzling display of natural beauty. Daniel prepared for departure with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything else, checking his equipment, reviewing the route to Fort Collins, ensuring that his horse was ready for the journey ahead. Sarah packed food for his travels, though he assured her that his scout training included finding sustenance along the trail. Still, she wanted to contribute something to his welfare, just as he had contributed so much to hers. "I've left my spare rifle and ammunition in the cabin," Daniel said as he secured his pack to his saddle. "You know how to shoot?" "Some," Sarah replied, though her experience was limited to hunting small game with her father years earlier. "Practice when the weather permits. Ammunition's not unlimited, but you need to be comfortable with the weapon if you're going to depend on it. Aim for the center of what you're trying to hit. Squeeze the trigger rather than pulling it, and remember that noise carries far in mountain air." Daniel mounted his horse, then sat for a moment looking down at Sarah. In the bright morning light, his weathered features seemed somehow younger, less burdened by whatever memories had carved lines around his eyes. "Take care of yourself," he said simply. "You too," Sarah replied, fighting the impulse to ask him to stay longer, to delay his departure for just another day or two. Daniel touched the brim of his hat in farewell, then guided his horse toward the narrow gap that led out of the valley. Sarah watched until he disappeared through the opening, listening until the sound of hoofbeats faded entirely into the mountain silence. For the first time since the freight wagon had deposited her in Cedar Junction, Sarah Mitchell was completely alone. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead she felt something unexpected, a sense of freedom so pure it was almost intoxicating. Everything that happened from this moment forward would be the result of her choices, her efforts, her ability to adapt and survive. The valley stretched around her in all directions, beautiful, challenging, and entirely hers to protect and maintain. She had work to do, skills to master, a life to build from the foundations up. The prospect was daunting, but for the first time in months, it was also full of possibility. Sarah walked back to the cabin, ready to begin her new life in earnest. Behind her, the entrance to the valley remained empty, but she carried with her the memory of Daniel's quiet confidence in her abilities. Whatever challenges the winter might bring, she would face them with the skills he had taught her and the strength she was still discovering within herself. The hidden valley had accepted her as its temporary guardian. Now she had to prove worthy of that trust. Over the following days, Sarah established routines that would sustain her through the long winter ahead. Morning began with tending the animals, milking Bessie, feeding the chickens, checking for eggs that would supplement her diet with fresh protein. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not complex thought, and she found comfort in the rhythms of animal care. Afternoons were devoted to maintenance tasks, splitting firewood, checking the cabin for signs of wear or damage, preparing food for the following day. Daniel had been right about the importance of staying busy. With no companions and no external schedule to follow, it would be easy to fall into listlessness or despair. Productive work provided structure and purpose to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly. Evenings belonged to education. Daniel had left behind a substantial collection of books, practical manuals about farming and animal husbandry, but also works of literature and philosophy that offered escape from the isolation. Sarah read by firelight, expanding her knowledge of subjects that might prove useful, while also feeding her mind with ideas that had nothing to do with mere survival. But as the days passed, and the memory of Daniel's presence began to fade, Sarah began to notice things about the valley that she had missed during his brief instruction period. Small details that suggested the hidden sanctuary might not be as secure as it appeared. The first sign came a week after Daniel's departure. Sarah was returning from checking the fish trap when she noticed fresh tracks in the snow near the valley's entrance, not the familiar prints of her own feet or the hoofprints left by Daniel's horse, but something else entirely. The tracks were partially obscured by wind and additional snowfall, making them difficult to interpret, but they appeared to have been made by several individuals traveling on foot. Sarah studied the tracks carefully, trying to apply the observational skills Daniel had demonstrated during their journey to the valley. The prints were larger than hers would be, suggesting men rather than women. They followed the cliff face for some distance, before disappearing onto rocky ground where snow hadn't accumulated. Most troubling, they seemed to circle the valley's perimeter, as if someone had been studying the terrain rather than simply passing through. That evening, Sarah reviewed Daniel's written instructions for references to unexpected visitors. His notes were thorough but focused primarily on natural hazards rather than human threats. He had mentioned the possibility of drifters or bandits, but in the context of general frontier dangers rather than specific concerns about the valley itself. These tracks might be innocent. Hunters pursuing game, travelers seeking shelter from the storm that had passed through the region. But they might also represent something more sinister, men who had discovered the valley's existence and were evaluating its potential for exploitation. Sarah spent a restless night considering her options. She could ignore the tracks and hope. They represented no genuine threat. She could attempt to follow the trail and determine who had made it, or she could prepare for the possibility of unwelcome visitors while hoping they would never materialize. The following morning brought her answer. As she emerged from the cabin to begin her daily rounds, Sarah noticed that the snow near the chicken coop had been disturbed during the night. Several birds were missing, and the remaining hens huddled nervously in the corners of their enclosure. Someone had been in the valley while she slept, moving close enough to the cabin to steal part of her food supply. The violation felt personal and threatening in ways that went beyond the simple loss of a few chickens. Her sanctuary had been breached by unknown individuals who clearly felt entitled to take what they wanted. Sarah armed herself with Daniel's rifle and made a careful circuit of the valley, looking for additional signs of intrusion. Near the stream, she found the remains of a small fire that had been hastily extinguished and covered with snow. Whoever had taken her chickens had been confident enough to cook and eat them within sight of her cabin. The message was clear. Sarah was being watched, evaluated, tested. Someone had discovered her presence in the valley and was determining whether she represented a threat to their activities or simply an opportunity for easy plunder. As she stood beside the concealed fire pit, rifle in hand and heart pounding with adrenaline, Sarah realized that her winter of peaceful isolation was about to become something far more dangerous and complex. The hidden valley might protect her from natural hazards, but it couldn't shield her from human predators who had somehow learned of its existence. For the first time since Daniel's departure, Sarah found herself wishing desperately that he would return, but the cavalry scout was days away, pursuing army business that might keep him absent for months. Whatever threat was developing, she would have to face it alone, armed with nothing but her wits, Daniel's rifle, and the determination to protect the sanctuary that had become her only hope for survival. The game had changed, and Sarah Mitchell was about to discover exactly how far she was willing to go to defend the life she was building in the hidden valley. 3 days after discovering the stolen chickens, Sarah's worst fears materialized in the form of voices echoing through the valley's entrance passage. She was splitting firewood behind the cabin when the sound reached her. Rough male voices discussing something in tones too low to distinguish words, but clear enough to confirm her suspicions about unwelcome visitors. Sarah abandoned the axe and moved quickly to the cabin's front window, positioning herself where she could observe the valley floor while remaining concealed. What she saw made her blood run cold. 4 men had emerged from the narrow entrance, leading horses and surveying the hidden sanctuary with the calculating expressions of predators who had discovered rich hunting grounds. Even at a distance, Sarah could tell these were not lost travelers or innocent hunters. Their clothes were too well maintained for drifters, their equipment too expensive for simple frontiersmen. More telling was their behavior. They moved with the confident arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted without concern for consequences. The leader was a tall man with prematurely grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He gestured toward the cabin while speaking to his companions, clearly organizing some kind of approach or strategy. The other 3 spread out slightly, creating a formation that would make escape difficult if Sarah attempted to flee. Sarah's mind raced through her limited options. The cabin was defensible, with thick log walls and shuttered windows that would stop most small arms fire. But she was outnumbered 4 to 1, and her supplies of ammunition were limited. A siege would heavily favor the attackers, especially if they were willing to wait for hunger or thirst to force her surrender. Flight was equally problematic. The valley's only exit was already controlled by the intruders, and the surrounding cliffs were too steep for anyone but an experienced climber to navigate safely. Even if she could escape the valley, she would be abandoning everything that made survival possible during the mountain winter. That left confrontation as her only viable choice. Sarah retrieved Daniel's rifle from its position beside the fireplace, checking to ensure it was properly loaded. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the rifle's action, but her mind felt surprisingly clear. Fear was present but manageable, subordinate to the determination that had carried her through the loss of her family and home. The men approached the cabin with deliberate slowness, clearly expecting their presence to intimidate rather than surprise. When they reached the porch, the gray-haired leader called out in a voice that carried false friendliness, "Hello inside. We're travelers looking for shelter, saw your smoke and hoped you might spare some hospitality for fellow Christians." Sarah remained silent, watching through a gap in the window shutters. The deception was crude, but potentially effective. A lone woman might feel obligated to provide assistance to men claiming distress, especially if she believed in the social conventions that governed civilized behavior. "Ma'am," the leader called again, "we know you're in there. Saw you working outside earlier. No need to be frightened. We're just looking for a warm meal and perhaps shelter for the night." Still, Sarah said nothing. Daniel's instructions had been clear about avoiding unnecessary risks, and admitting strangers to the cabin definitely qualified as unnecessary. Let them make the first aggressive move, she decided. Force them to reveal their true intentions. Before committing to a course of action, the leader's tone hardened slightly. "Ma'am, it's a powerful cold out here, and we've been traveling for days. Common decency suggests you'd offer aid to fellow travelers. Wouldn't want folks thinking you lacked proper Christian charity." The attempt to shame her into compliance confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the men's true nature. Legitimate travelers would accept refusal gracefully rather than trying to manipulate her emotions. These men expected to get what they wanted through pressure and intimidation. When Sarah still didn't respond, the leader gestured to his companions. 2 of them moved toward the barn, while the 3rd began circling the cabin, presumably looking for alternative entrances or ways to observe. "The interior. Looks like we've got ourselves a stubborn one, boys," the leader announced, abandoning all pretense of friendliness. "Woman who won't show proper hospitality to visitors might need some education in frontier manners." Sarah positioned the rifle barrel through a gap in the shutters, aiming at the leader's chest. Her father had taught her to shoot years earlier, and while she was far from expert, the range was short enough that accuracy wouldn't require exceptional skill. "I can hear you moving around out there," she called through the window. "This is private property, and you're not welcome. I suggest you collect your horses and continue on your way." The leader's laughter was harsh and unpleasant. "Private property? We're in the middle of nowhere. Nearest law is 100 miles away. Property rights don't mean much when there's nobody to enforce them." "I'm enforcing them," Sarah replied, letting the rifle barrel become visible to emphasize her point. "And I'm a better shot than you might expect from a woman alone." "That's so." The leader's voice carried amusement rather than concern. "Well, let's see how good you are when you're facing 4 men instead of target practice." One of the men near the barn had apparently found what he was looking for. "Boss!" he called. "Got fresh milk in here and feed for probably a dozen animals. This place is set up for long-term habitation. Good supplies, too." The leader's expression grew more calculating. "Hear that, ma'am? Sounds like you've got quite a setup here. Enough to keep 4 men comfortable through the winter, I'd imagine. Mighty generous of you to offer such hospitality." "I'm not offering anything," Sarah said firmly. "Take your men and leave, or I'll start shooting." Now, the leader said, moving closer to the cabin. "No need for threats. We're reasonable men. Perhaps we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone." Sarah kept the rifle trained on him as he approached. "What kind of arrangement?" "Simple enough. You provide food and shelter through the winter, and we provide protection from the various dangers that threaten lone women in remote locations. Bears, mountain lions, hostile Indians, desperate men who might not be as civilized as ourselves." The proposal was essentially slavery disguised as partnership, Sarah realized. These men intended to take control of the valley and everything in it, including her. They would consume her carefully hoarded supplies, probably destroy the delicate balance of resources that made survival possible, and discard her when she was no longer useful. "Counter-proposal," Sarah said. "You leave immediately, and I don't put a bullet through your chest." The leader's patience finally snapped. "Boys, I think our hostess needs some encouragement to be more cooperative. Miller, check the back of the cabin. Stevens, see if there's a way onto that roof. Thompson, keep watch on the front windows." Sarah realized the negotiation phase was over. These men intended to take what they wanted by force, confident that a lone woman couldn't effectively resist 4 armed and experienced fighters. They were probably right, but Sarah had no intention of surrendering without making them pay a price for their aggression. The man called Miller was moving toward the cabin's rear wall, probably looking for a back door or window that might provide easier access. Sarah shifted her position to maintain visual contact while keeping the rifle aimed at the leader. "Last warning," she called. "Leave now or face the consequences." "What consequences?" the leader replied. "You're going to shoot all 4 of us before we reach you. Even if you're as good as you claim, odds are against you." Sarah's response was to squeeze the trigger. The rifle's report echoed off the valley walls like thunder, and the leader staggered backward with a cry of pain and surprise. She had aimed for his shoulder rather than his heart, hoping to wound rather than kill. But the bullet's impact was sufficient to convince him that her threats were genuine. "She shot me," he gasped, clutching his left arm where blood was already soaking through his coat. "The crazy woman actually shot me." "Kill her!" one of the other men shouted. "Kill her now!" Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as the remaining 3 men opened fire on the cabin. Bullets splintered wood and shattered one of the windows, but the log walls proved as effective as Daniel had promised. Sarah kept low, moving between firing positions to avoid presenting a predictable target. She managed to get off 2 more shots before the men adjusted their tactics. The rifle's smoke and muzzle flash revealed her position each time she fired, allowing them to concentrate their return fire more effectively. Soon, the interior of the cabin was filled with splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Burn her. Out!" the wounded leader commanded from whatever cover he had found. "Set fire to the roof." The prospect of fire was far more terrifying than bullets. The cabin would burn readily once flames took hold, and the winter cold made surviving outdoors impossible. Sarah had to prevent them from implementing that strategy, even if it meant taking greater risks. She moved to a different window and spotted one of the men approaching the cabin with what appeared to be a burning branch from their earlier campfire. Sarah aimed carefully and fired, sending the man diving for cover and dropping the makeshift torch harmlessly into the snow. But her ammunition was running low, and the attackers were learning to coordinate their movements. Soon, they would rush the cabin simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming her ability to defend all approaches. Sarah needed help, and there was only one possible source. The signal mirror Daniel had left among the emergency supplies was intended for communicating with rescue parties in case of serious emergency. Sarah wasn't certain anyone would see the reflected sunlight or understand its meaning, but it represented her only hope of summoning assistance. She retrieved the mirror from its storage location and positioned herself near the front window, angling the surface to catch the afternoon sun. The reflected light beams swept across the valley entrance and the surrounding peaks, flashing the distress signal Daniel had taught her during their brief time together. "What's she doing now?" one of the attackers called. "Signaling someone," another replied with concern. "Maybe this place isn't as isolated as we thought." The possibility of reinforcements arriving clearly worried the men more than Sarah's rifle. They increased the intensity of their attack, firing rapidly at any point where she might be positioned. The cabin's interior became a chaos of flying, wood chips and broken glass as bullets found gaps in her defenses. Sarah continued flashing the signal mirror while returning fire when opportunities presented themselves. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, but she had to maintain the illusion of effective resistance for as long as possible. If help was coming, she needed to survive until it arrived. The attack might have continued indefinitely, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats suddenly echoed through the valley. Sarah's heart leaped with hope. Someone had seen her signal and was responding, but her relief transformed to horror when she realized the new arrivals weren't rescuers. "About time you got here," the wounded leader called to the three mounted men who had emerged from the valley entrance. "Woman's been giving us more trouble than expected." The newcomers dismounted and surveyed the situation with professional competence. Unlike the original 4 attackers, these men moved with military precision and carried themselves with the confidence of experienced soldiers. Their leader was a compact man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that missed nothing. "Situation. Report," he commanded in tones that expected immediate compliance. "Found the woman exactly where we expected," the wounded leader replied. "Set up nice and comfortable weather for the winter. Plenty of supplies, good defensible position. She's been shooting at us for the past hour, but we've got her pinned down." The bearded man studied the cabin thoughtfully. "Any sign of the scout?" Sarah's blood turned to ice. These men weren't random bandits who had stumbled across the valley. They had come here specifically, looking for Daniel and expecting to find her. Someone had told them about the hidden sanctuary and its current occupants. "No sign of Hawthorne," the wounded leader confirmed. "Just the woman, like your information suggested." "Good," the bearded man replied. "Hawthorne's created enough problems for our operations. Time to eliminate that threat permanently." Sarah's mind raced as the implications became clear. These men were connected to whatever army business kept Daniel away from the valley. They had tracked him here, discovered his arrangement with her, and now intended to use the valley as a trap. When Daniel returned, he would ride straight into an ambush. "What about the woman?" one of the newcomers asked. The bearded leader considered this. "Useful as bait, assuming Hawthorne cares enough about her to take risks for her safety. If not, she's expendable once she's served her purpose." The casual discussion of her fate as a disposable asset filled Sarah with cold fury. These men had invaded her sanctuary, threatened her life, and now planned to use her to destroy the man who had shown her kindness when no one else would. The violation went beyond simple crime. It was an assault on everything decent and honorable about human behavior. "Listen carefully, woman," the bearded leader called toward the cabin. "We know about your arrangement with Scout Hawthorne. We know he'll be returning to check on you before spring. When he does, you're going to help us capture him, or you're going to die slowly and painfully. Your choice." Sarah's response was to fire her remaining bullets at the speaker, forcing him to dive for cover behind a tree. The gesture was futile. Her ammunition was exhausted, and 7 armed men now surrounded the cabin, but it expressed her refusal to cooperate with their plans. "Stubborn," the leader observed with what might have been admiration. "We'll see how long that lasts when hunger and thirst start working on her resolve." As darkness fell over the valley, Sarah found herself besieged by enemies who were prepared to wait for weeks or months until Daniel returned. They had food, ammunition, and numerical superiority. All she had was determination and the increasingly faint hope that Daniel might somehow learn of the trap before walking into it. The hidden valley had become a prison, and Sarah Mitchell was both captive and bait in a deadly game whose stakes extended far beyond her own survival. The winter that had promised peace and renewal was transforming into a test of endurance that would determine not only her fate, but the fate of the man who had risked everything to offer her a chance at a new life. Outside the cabin, she could hear the men making camp, settling in for a siege that might last until spring. Inside, Sarah counted her remaining resources and prepared for what would probably be the longest and most dangerous night of her life. The past had finally caught up with her, but not in the way she had expected. Instead of her own mistakes returning to destroy her new beginning, it was Daniel's past that threatened to claim them both. And for the first time since losing her family's farm, Sarah found herself caring more about someone else's survival than her own. The siege entered its 3rd day, with Sarah's situation growing increasingly desperate. The 7 men had established a disciplined watch rotation around the cabin, ensuring she couldn't escape while systematically destroying her ability to survive independently. They had slaughtered her remaining chickens for food, contaminated her water supply by dumping waste upstream, and set fire to her woodpile during the night. Forcing her to watch precious fuel burn while staying warm became an ever more pressing concern. Sleep had become impossible. Every time Sarah closed her eyes, she heard movement outside, boots on snow, whispered conversations, the metallic sounds of weapons being cleaned and prepared. The bearded leader, who she had learned was called Major Carson, maintained psychological pressure through constant communication attempts. "Miss Mitchell," Carson called through the dawn air, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a man accustomed to breaking opponents through patience rather than force. "You've proven your courage admirably, but practical considerations must eventually override stubborn pride. You're running out of food, fuel, and time." Sarah remained silent, conserving her energy while reviewing the cabin's dwindling resources. Her food stores were adequate for perhaps another week, if carefully rationed. Firewood would last 3 days at most, assuming she burned only what was absolutely necessary to prevent freezing. Water was the most critical shortage. She had perhaps 2 days' supply remaining, and the contaminated stream would make her sick even if she could reach it safely. "We're not unreasonable men," Carson continued. "Cooperate with our plans for Hawthorne, and we'll provide safe passage to Fort Collins. Refuse, and you'll freeze or starve before help arrives. The choice remains yours." Through gaps in the shuttered windows, Sarah could see the smoke from their campfire, smell the coffee they brewed with casual abundance while she rationed her own supplies drop by drop. The psychological impact was deliberate and effective. a constant reminder of the comfort and security that cooperation would provide. But Sarah had made her decision during the first night of the siege. She would not betray Daniel, regardless of the personal cost. The man who had offered her sanctuary when she had nothing deserved better than to ride into a trap created through her weakness or cowardice. The question was how to warn him without surrendering the valley to Carson's forces. The signal mirror had been her best hope, but 3 days of flashing distress signals had produced no response. Either no one was positioned to see the reflected light, or potential rescuers were too distant to arrive in time. That left direct action as her only remaining option. If she could eliminate enough of Carson's men to level the odds, Daniel might have a fighting chance when he returned. The plan was probably suicidal, but it offered the only possibility of protecting the man who had shown her unexpected kindness. Sarah spent the morning of the 4th day preparing for what would likely be her final battle. She cleaned Daniel's rifle thoroughly, though her ammunition was limited to the handful of cartridges she had conserved during the initial fight. She arranged furniture to create firing positions that would provide maximum protection while allowing clear shots at multiple targets. Most importantly, she steeled herself mentally for the violence that effective resistance would require. The opportunity came that afternoon when Carson made his daily approach to negotiate. 3 men accompanied him while the others maintained perimeter watch, a tactical distribution that offered Sarah her best chance of inflicting significant casualties before being overwhelmed. "Miss Mitchell," Carson called from his position near the cabin's front porch. "Time grows short. Hawthorne could return any day, and your current circumstances will make you useless as bait if you're dead from exposure or starvation." Sarah positioned herself at the window, rifle ready. "I have a counter-proposal, Major," she called back, using his rank to demonstrate that she understood the military nature of his operation. Carson's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm listening. Release my valley. Return to wherever you came from, and I'll forget this conversation ever happened. Continue this siege, and I'll make sure Daniel knows exactly what kind of trap you've prepared." Carson's laughter held genuine amusement. "And how exactly would you accomplish that communication, Miss Mitchell? You're surrounded, outnumbered, and rapidly running out of resources. What leverage do you imagine you possess?" Sarah's response was to put a bullet through the shoulder of the man standing closest to Carson, dropping him with a scream of pain and surprise. Before the others could react, she had shifted position and fired again, wounding a second attacker and creating panic among men who had grown comfortable with their apparent invulnerability. "That's my leverage," Sarah called as gunfire erupted. "Around the cabin. Every day you delay gives me more opportunities to reduce your numbers. Keep this up, and there won't be enough of you left to handle Daniel when he arrives." The renewed battle was fiercer than the original fight, driven by anger and frustration on both sides. Carson's men concentrated their fire more effectively, sending continuous volleys through every gap and opening they could identify. But Sarah had learned from the earlier engagement, moving constantly between prepared positions and making maximum use of the cabin's defensive advantages. Her carefully conserved ammunition allowed her to maintain effective return fire for nearly an hour before her supplies were exhausted. But the psychological impact of her resistance clearly affected the attackers' morale. 2 more men had been wounded, one seriously, and their confidence in easy victory was badly shaken. "Enough!" Carson finally commanded, calling off the assault. "Fall back and maintain perimeter watch. No more frontal attacks." As the gunfire died away, Sarah assessed the results of her gamble. She had wounded 4 of the 7 attackers, significantly reducing their combat effectiveness. But her ammunition was completely exhausted, leaving her defenseless against any future assault. The next phase of the siege would be a war of attrition that she could not win. Night fell, with temperatures dropping below 0 and wind howling through the valley like a living thing. Sarah huddled near the dying fire, wrapped in every blanket and coat she could find. Without adequate fuel, the cabin's interior was becoming as cold as the winter air outside. Soon, she would face the choice between freezing to death or surrendering to Carson's forces. It was during the darkest hour before dawn that she heard something that made her heart leap with hope and terror simultaneously. The sound of a horse, picking its way carefully down the rocky trail that led to the valley entrance. Daniel was returning, exactly as Carson had predicted, riding straight into the trap that had been so carefully prepared. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly despite the desperate urgency of the situation. Carson's men would be alert for this moment. They had positioned themselves to intercept Daniel before he could reach the cabin or realize the danger he faced. Her only chance to help him was to create a distraction significant enough to disrupt their ambush. The cabin's oil lamps provided her solution. If she could start a fire large enough to illuminate the valley and destroy Carson's advantage of concealment, Daniel might have enough warning to escape or fight on more equal terms. The plan would probably result in the cabin's destruction and her own death, but it offered Daniel his best chance of survival. Sarah gathered every lamp, candle, and combustible liquid she could find, arranging them throughout the cabin's interior. When Daniel reached the valley floor and Carson's men moved to spring their trap, she would transform the cabin into a beacon that would expose the ambush and give Daniel precious seconds to react. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the soft voice of a man talking to his horse in the gentle tones that characterized Daniel's interaction with animals. Sarah positioned herself near the front window with a burning candle, ready to ignite the preparation she had made. "Now," she heard Carson command from somewhere near the valley entrance. "Take him alive if possible." Sarah touched the candle. Flame to the nearest lamp, beginning a chain reaction that would consume everything she had built during her weeks in the valley. As fire spread through the cabin's interior, she threw open the front door and shouted into the night, "Daniel, it's a trap! 7 men with rifles!" Gunfire erupted immediately, but the sudden illumination from the burning cabin had indeed disrupted Carson's carefully planned ambush. Instead of catching Daniel unaware, the attackers found themselves exposed to return fire from a man who had survived years of frontier combat through superior skill and lightning-fast reflexes. The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. Daniel moved through the valley like a ghost, using terrain and shadow to avoid the crossfire, while picking off Carson's men with methodical precision. His cavalry training was evident in every action. The way he used his horse for mobile cover, the economy of movement that wasted no motion, the deadly accuracy that made every shot count. But even Daniel's exceptional skills couldn't overcome the numerical disadvantage indefinitely. Carson's remaining men were also experienced fighters, and they adapted quickly to the changed circumstances. Soon the valley echoed with gunfire from multiple positions as both sides maneuvered for tactical advantage. Sarah emerged from the burning cabin carrying the last of her water supply in a metal bucket. If she was going to die tonight, she would at least contribute to Daniel's chances of survival. Moving carefully through the smoke and chaos, she worked her way toward the position where Carson was directing his men's movements. The major was so focused on the tactical situation that he didn't notice Sarah's approach until she was close enough to strike. Her improvised weapon, the heavy water bucket, caught him across the back of the head with enough force to drop him unconscious into the snow. "Carson's down!" she shouted to Daniel, hoping the information would help him assess the changing situation. With their leader unconscious and half their number wounded or dead, Carson's remaining men began to lose cohesion. The disciplined military operation dissolved into individual survival as each fighter sought to escape the valley before. Daniel's superior position and skill could eliminate them entirely. "Retreat," one of them called. "Fall back to the horses." The surviving attackers broke from their positions and fled toward the valley entrance, carrying their wounded and abandoning their equipment in their haste to escape. Daniel let them go rather than pursuing into potentially prepared positions, a decision that demonstrated the tactical wisdom that had kept him alive through years of dangerous assignments. As dawn broke over the valley, Sarah and Daniel found themselves standing amid the smoking ruins of what had been her sanctuary. The cabin was destroyed, the barn damaged, the careful preparations for winter survival reduced to ash and debris, but they were alive, and Carson's threat had been eliminated. "Are you hurt?" Daniel asked, his first concern for her welfare, despite the destruction of his family's legacy. "Bruised and exhausted, but whole," Sarah replied, suddenly aware of how close she had come to death during the night's events. "I'm sorry about the cabin. I had to create light to warn you about the ambush." Daniel surveyed the damage with remarkable calm. "Cabin can be rebuilt. Lives can't be replaced." He looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You saved my life tonight. Carson's ambush would have succeeded if you hadn't warned me." "You saved mine first," Sarah replied, "in Cedar Junction, when I had nothing left. Everything that happened after was possible because you offered me a chance." They spent the morning securing Carson and the other wounded prisoners, gathering information about the conspiracy that had led to the ambush, and assessing what could be salvaged from the valley's damaged infrastructure. The attackers had been part of a larger criminal organization that used military deserters to prey on isolated settlements and individuals. Daniel's scouting activities had disrupted their operations enough to make his elimination a priority. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they prepared to transport the prisoners to Fort Collins for trial. Daniel looked around the valley that had been his family's refuge for 15 years. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "Together, if you're willing. Valleys still. Good land, still protected, still capable of supporting people who understand its value." Sarah considered the offer, remembering her desperate arrival in Cedar Junction and the unlikely chain of events that had brought her to this moment. The hidden valley had indeed become her sanctuary, but more than that, it had become home in ways that went beyond simple survival. "Yes," she said, reaching for Daniel's hand, "let's rebuild it together." The winter that had begun with desperation and isolation was ending with partnership and hope. Sarah Mitchell had found more than shelter in the hidden valley. She had found purpose, strength, and the possibility of a future built on shared trust rather than individual struggle. As they rode toward Fort Collins with their prisoners, Sarah looked back once at the valley that had tested and transformed her. When they returned to begin rebuilding, it would be as partners rather than benefactor and dependent, as equals who had proven their worth to each other through the crucible of shared danger. The hidden valley would rise again, stronger than before, protected by two people who understood the true value of sanctuary and the price that must sometimes be paid to preserve it. The journey to Fort Collins took 5 days through mountain passes that tested both horses and riders with their treacherous footing and bitter cold. Sarah rode beside Daniel, leading a string of pack animals that carried their prisoners and the evidence of the conspiracy that had nearly cost them their lives. Behind them, the hidden valley lay empty and damaged, waiting for their return and the rebuilding that would transform it from shelter into true home. Major Carson remained unconscious for the first 2 days, secured across his horse like cargo, while his surviving men nursed wounds and contemplated futures that would likely end at the wrong end of a rope. The evidence Daniel had gathered from their abandoned camp painted a clear picture of an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating throughout the territories for months, preying on isolated settlements and individual targets with military precision. "How long have they been tracking you?" Sarah asked as they made camp on the second night, watching Daniel secure the prisoners with practiced efficiency. "Probably since last spring," Daniel replied, checking the ropes that bound the conscious men. "Started noticing signs that someone was following my scout routes, but I attributed it to coincidence. Should have realized they were mapping my movements, learning my patterns." The admission carried self-recrimination that Sarah recognized from her own experience with devastating hindsight. You couldn't have known. Military deserters using army tactics against their former comrades, that's not something most people would anticipate. "My job is to anticipate threats," Daniel said grimly. "Failure to recognize this one nearly got you killed." Sarah studied his profile in the firelight, noting the tension that hadn't existed before the attack on the valley. The easy confidence that had characterized Daniel's manner during their initial acquaintance had been replaced by something harder, more vigilant. The man who had offered her sanctuary was still present, but he was now tempered by the knowledge that his generosity had exposed them both to mortal danger. "The valley is gone because of choices I made," Daniel continued. "My parents built that place as a refuge, and I destroyed it by bringing trouble to its doorstep." "You didn't destroy anything," Sarah said firmly. "Carson and his men destroyed the buildings, but the valley itself, the land, the water, the natural defenses, all of that remains, and it's still the safest place either of us knows." Daniel looked at her with something approaching surprise. "You want to go back? After everything that happened? Where else would I go?" Sarah asked practically. "I have no family, no resources, no connections anywhere else. But more than that, the valley became home during those weeks I spent alone there. Not just shelter, but the first place since my parents' farm where I felt like I belonged." The confession was more personal than anything she had shared during their previous conversations, an acknowledgement that the hidden sanctuary had represented more than simple survival. In the valley, she had discovered capabilities and strengths that she hadn't known she possessed. The prospect of abandoning that discovery for the uncertainty of starting over elsewhere felt like betraying the person she had worked so hard to become. "It won't be easy," Daniel warned. "Everything will have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Cabin, barn, storage facilities, all the infrastructure my parents spent years developing. And there's no guarantee that other threats won't emerge. Carson's organization might have other cells operating in the territory." "Then we'll face those threats when they come," Sarah replied. "But we'll face them together, as partners rather than protector and dependent." The word partners hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went beyond simple business arrangements. During the siege and battle, they had functioned as a team with natural coordination that suggested deeper compatibility. But neither had yet addressed the emotional dimensions of their relationship or the possibilities that rebuilding the valley together might create. Major Carson regained consciousness on the third day, immediately testing his bonds with the systematic approach of a professional soldier. When he realized escape was impossible, he shifted to psychological warfare, attempting to create discord between his captors through carefully chosen provocations. "Touching story," he observed during one of their rest stops, having overheard Sarah and Daniel discussing reconstruction plans, woman with nothing and man with destroyed inheritance, planning to build paradise together. Very romantic, in a pathetic sort of way. Daniel ignored the comment, but Sarah recognized the deliberate attempt to undermine their partnership. "Jealous, Major?" she asked sweetly. "Must be difficult to watch people build something positive while your own organization crumbles around." "You," Carson's laugh was harsh and knowing. "You think this is over, that capturing one cell eliminates the entire network? There are dozens of groups like mine operating throughout the territories, and they all share information about targets and opportunities. Your valley will be marked now as a place of interest. Others will come." The threat was probably intended to create fear and division, but Sarah found herself analyzing it as useful intelligence instead. If Carson's organization was indeed larger than they had realized, then she and Daniel would need to prepare for future confrontations. The Valley's defensibility would need to be enhanced, and their own capabilities would require further development. "Let them come," Sarah said calmly. "We'll be ready." Carson studied her with professional interest. "You've changed, haven't you? From desperate refugee to frontier warrior in a matter of months. Impressive adaptation, though I wonder how long your resolve will last when reality sets in." "What reality is that?" Sarah asked. "The reality of isolation, hardship, and constant vigilance that frontier life demands. The reality of watching everything you build get destroyed by forces beyond your control. The reality of losing people you care about to violence, disease, or simple accident." Carson's voice carried the bitter wisdom of experience. "I've seen dozens of idealistic couples try to carve civilization out of wilderness. Most don't last 2 years before circumstances break them." "It's not as bad as I feared," Sarah said, walking among the ruins with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to see potential amid destruction. "The bones of the place are still sound. We can build on what remains instead of starting completely over." Daniel nodded, but his attention was focused on improvements rather than simple restoration. "This time, we do it right," he said, pointing toward the valley's entrance. "Defensive positions there and there, clear fields of fire, early warning systems that don't depend on signal mirrors. Never again will anyone be able to approach without our knowledge." The months at Fort Collins had changed both of them in subtle but important ways. Sarah had gained confidence through her successful testimony and the respect shown by military officers who recognized competence regardless of gender. Daniel had evolved from solitary scout to protective husband, his tactical thinking now encompassing not just personal survival, but the security of home and family. They had also acquired resources that made rebuilding feasible rather than merely hopeful. The bounty placed on Carson's organization had been substantial, and their testimony had earned them additional compensation from grateful territorial authorities. More importantly, Colonel Morrison had provided letters of introduction to merchants and craftsmen in Cheyenne who could supply materials and expertise for frontier construction projects. "First priority is shelter," Sarah said, reviewing the plans they had developed during their weeks at the fort. "Something livable while we work on the permanent structures, then the barn, then defenses, then the cabin proper." "Agreed," Daniel replied. "But we also need to think about sustainability. My scouting work will provide income, but the valley should be able to support us independently if necessary. Larger garden, better food preservation, maybe even some cash crops if we can identify markets." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders making no attempt at concealment. Sarah and Daniel both reached for weapons before recognizing the voices calling their names in friendly greeting. "Hawthorne! Mrs. Hawthorne!" The lead rider was Sergeant Miller from Fort Collins, accompanied by a small detachment of soldiers and several civilian workers. "Colonel Morrison sent supplies and assistance for your rebuilding project." The wagon train that followed contained lumber, tools, hardware, food supplies, and even a prefabricated structure that could serve as temporary shelter while permanent buildings were constructed. More valuable than the materials were the skilled craftsmen who had volunteered to spend several weeks helping with construction in exchange for the opportunity to explore business opportunities in the growing territories. "The Colonel wanted to express the Army's appreciation for your service," Miller explained as they began unloading supplies. "Your intelligence about Carson's organization helped us break up similar groups operating throughout the region. This assistance is well earned." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the unexpected generosity, but also concerned about accepting charity that might create obligations or dependencies. "We're grateful for the help," she said carefully, "but we insist on paying fair wages for any work performed." Miller smiled, recognizing the pride that motivated her concern. "Already arranged, ma'am. The territorial government authorized payment for construction services as part of their Frontier Development Initiative. These men are being compensated properly for their time and expertise." The arrival of help transformed the rebuilding project from a daunting challenge into an exciting opportunity. With skilled workers to handle specialized tasks, Sarah and Daniel could focus on planning and coordination while learning construction techniques that would serve them throughout their lives in the valley. The temporary shelter went up in 2 days, providing comfortable living quarters that were actually superior to many permanent structures Sarah had known during her childhood. The design was practical and efficient, with good insulation, multiple windows for light and ventilation, and interior space that could accommodate both living and working activities. "This is wonderful," Sarah said as they moved their few possessions into the new structure. "It's like having a real home again, instead of just a survival shelter." Daniel looked around the interior with satisfaction. "Better than what I grew up with, truth be told. My parents were pioneers, not craftsmen. They were built for necessity rather than comfort." As construction progressed on the permanent buildings, Sarah found herself taking charge of logistics and planning, while Daniel focused on security improvements and the technical aspects of frontier engineering. Their partnership evolved naturally into complementary specializations that maximized their combined effectiveness. Sarah's organizational skills, developed through managing her family's farm household, proved invaluable for coordinating materials, schedules, and the diverse personalities of their volunteer workforce. She established meal schedules, maintained supply inventories, and ensured that each day's work built logically toward long-term objectives. Daniel's military experience guided the defensive preparations that would protect their investment from future threats. He positioned observation posts with overlapping fields of view, created concealed weapons caches at strategic locations, and designed the new cabin to serve as a fortified stronghold if circumstances required. But the most important development was the way their relationship deepened through shared responsibility and mutual reliance. Marriage had formalized their partnership, but daily cooperation in pursuit of common goals created the emotional intimacy that transformed legal commitment into genuine love. "You're smiling," Daniel observed one evening as they reviewed the day's progress by lamplight. "I'm happy," Sarah replied, surprised by the simple truth of the statement. "For the first time since my parents died, I'm genuinely happy, not just surviving or coping, but truly content with my life and excited about the future." Daniel set aside his construction notes and moved closer to her. "Even with all the work ahead of us, all the challenges we'll face?" "Especially because of those things," Sarah said. "We're building something together, creating a life that will be entirely our own achievement. Every board we nail, every fence we build, every garden we plant, will be the result of our shared efforts and decisions." Their first spring in the rebuilt valley established patterns that would sustain them for years to come. Mornings began with animal care and garden work, activities that provided immediate satisfaction and visible progress. Afternoons were devoted to construction and improvement projects, gradually transforming the valley into a more comfortable and secure homestead. Evenings belonged to planning, reading, and the quiet conversations that built emotional intimacy between partners who had learned to trust each other completely. The new cabin took shape slowly but steadily, incorporating lessons learned from the original structure's destruction, thicker walls, better insulation, multiple exit routes, and hidden storage spaces that could protect essential supplies from theft or destruction. The design balanced comfort with security, creating a home that could serve as sanctuary without feeling like a fortress. "It's beautiful," Sarah said as they stood before the completed structure in late summer. "Better than anything I dreamed of when I was sleeping in the trading post's back room." The cabin was indeed impressive. 2 stories of carefully fitted logs with a stone foundation that would last for generations. Large windows provided excellent natural light, while shutters offered protection during storms or attacks. A covered porch extended across the front, creating outdoor living space that took advantage of the valley's spectacular views. Inside, the layout reflected their partnership in its division of spaces. A large common room served for cooking, dining, and socializing, while separate areas provided privacy for individual activities. The loft contained their bedroom and storage space, while the ground floor included a study where Daniel could work on his scouting reports and Sarah could manage the household's increasingly complex financial records. "Our home," Daniel said, putting his arm around Sarah's shoulders, "built to last, designed for happiness." The garden had exceeded all expectations, producing enough vegetables to feed them through the winter with surplus for trade or sale. Sarah's knowledge of preservation techniques, combined with improved storage facilities, meant they would face the coming winter with confidence rather than anxiety about food security. More importantly, they had established relationships with neighboring settlements that provided both social connection and economic opportunity. The valley's isolation was no longer total. They had become part of a regional network of farms, ranches, and small towns that supported each other through trade, information sharing, and mutual assistance during emergencies. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by while you were checking the eastern fence," Sarah told Daniel one afternoon in late September. "Her husband wants to know if we'd be interested in a contract to supply vegetables to their store in Millerville. Apparently, our produce has developed quite a reputation for quality." Daniel smiled at the pride in Sarah's voice. "What did you tell her? That we'd consider it for next year's growing season? This year's surplus is already committed to the fort and 2 other customers." Sarah consulted the notebook where she tracked their business dealings. "At current prices, we'll clear almost $300 profit from the garden alone." The financial success was gratifying, but more important was what it represented: the transformation of the valley from subsistence refuge into productive enterprise. They were no longer simply surviving in isolation, but thriving as part of the regional economy. As autumn arrived and the valley prepared for winter, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperation to prosperity in less than 2 years. The woman who had stepped off the freight wagon in Cedar Junction with nothing but hope and determination had evolved into a confident frontier wife and successful businesswoman. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Daniel asked one evening as they sat before the fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth he had built with his own hands. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I miss my parents, and I miss the security of thinking I knew what my future would hold. But I don't miss the person I was then, passive, dependent, afraid to take risks or make difficult decisions." "You were never passive," Daniel disagreed. "Desperate circumstances sometimes look like passivity, but you were actively fighting for survival every day. You just hadn't yet discovered your own strength." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But I like who I've become better than who I was. I like being responsible for my own success or failure, being able to solve problems through my own efforts, being part of a partnership where both people contribute equally." Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, transforming The valley into the winter wonderland that had first captured Sarah's imagination. But this year she felt no anxiety about the approaching cold or isolation. The cabin was warm and secure, the pantry was full of preserved food, and the barn housed healthy animals that would provide milk, eggs, and companionship through the dark months ahead. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, noting her contemplative silence. "The future," Sarah replied. "Our children, if we're blessed with them, the improvements we'll make to the valley over the years, the life we're building together." Daniel's smile was soft and content. Big dreams for someone who arrived here with nothing but a canvas bag and hope. "The best dreams usually start with nothing but hope," Sarah said. "Everything else is just the work of making them real." As winter settled over the hidden valley, Sarah and Daniel Hawthorne faced the season with confidence born of preparation, partnership, and hard-won experience. They had created more than just a home. They had built a foundation for a future that would grow stronger with each passing year. The valley that had once been Daniel's inherited refuge had become their shared sanctuary, a place where two people who had lost everything could build something better than what they had lost. The woman with no home, no money, and no hope had found all three, and more besides. She had found the strength to create her own destiny in partnership with a man who valued her courage as much as her companionship. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, but inside their cabin, warmth and light created a sanctuary that no storm could breach. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but they would face them together as equals and partners in the great adventure of building a life worth living. The hidden valley had kept its promise, providing sanctuary for those brave enough to claim it and wise enough to protect it. And in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the evidence of their shared achievements, Sarah Mitchell Hawthorne finally understood that she had found something more precious than security or prosperity. She had found the place where she belonged, and the person with whom she belonged there. Their story had begun with desperation and kindness between strangers. It would continue with love and partnership between equals who had discovered that the strongest foundations are built not on what people inherit, but on what they create together through courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to each other's welfare. The hidden valley was no longer hidden, it had become home. Winter deepened around the valley with a fury that tested even their improved preparations. January brought blizzards that lasted for days, burying the cabin under drifts that reached the second-story windows. But inside their sanctuary, Sarah and Daniel discovered that the enforced intimacy of winter isolation had become a blessing rather than a hardship. "Listen," Sarah said one evening, as they sat reading by the fire, the wind howling outside like a living thing. Daniel looked up from his book, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. "What is it?" "Nothing," Sarah smiled. "That's what I mean. No gunfire, no shouting, no fear, just us, warm and safe, with time to actually enjoy each other's company." Daniel set aside his reading and moved to sit beside her on the couch he had built during the autumn months. "Different from last winter." "Completely different," Sarah agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "Last winter I was afraid every moment would be my last. This winter I'm planning what we'll plant in the spring garden expansion." The contrast was indeed remarkable. The previous winter had been about survival, counting every piece of firewood, rationing food, listening constantly for threats. This winter was about living, planning improvements, discussing dreams, enjoying the luxury of security that allowed them to think beyond immediate necessities. "I've been thinking about children," Sarah said quietly, the words carrying weight. In the stillness of the cabin, Daniel's arm tightened around her. And I think I'm ready. Not just practically, we certainly have the resources and stability now, but emotionally. I want to raise children here, in this valley, with you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could feel the tension in his body as he processed the implications of her statement. Children would represent the ultimate commitment to their life in the valley, the transformation from temporary arrangement to permanent settlement. "It's what I want too," he said finally. "But are you certain? Children change everything. The freedom to travel, to take risks, to make decisions based solely on our own needs and desires. Children also give life meaning beyond personal satisfaction," Sarah replied. "They represent hope for the future, legacy, the continuation of what we've built here." The conversation continued deep into the night, covering practical considerations, education, medical care, safety, but also emotional ones. What kind of parents they wanted to be, how they would balance frontier realities with civilized values, how they would prepare their children for both the opportunities and challenges of territorial life. By February, their discussions had evolved into active planning. Sarah began corresponding with teachers in Denver about educational materials and methods that could be adapted for isolated settings. Daniel started designing additions to the cabin that would accommodate growing family needs while maintaining security and efficiency. The mail delivery that brought their letters also carried news from the outside world that reminded them how much their lives had changed. Former neighbors from Missouri wrote about continuing struggles with debt and crop failures. Friends from Cedar Junction described the harsh winter that had claimed several lives among those less prepared than Sarah and Daniel. "Mrs. Garrett died in January," Sarah read from a letter sent by the trading post's new owner. "Pneumonia took her during the worst of the cold snap. She asked me to tell you, if I ever had the chance, that she was proud of how well you'd done for yourself." The news brought unexpected grief for a woman who had shown Sarah small kindnesses during her darkest hours. But it also reinforced how fortunate they had been to find each other and create a life that provided both physical security and emotional fulfillment. "She gave me jerky and hardtack for the journey here," Sarah remembered. "Such a small gesture, but it meant everything to someone who had nothing." "We should name the baby after her if it's a girl," Daniel suggested. Margaret was her first name, I believe. The casual reference to the baby made Sarah's heart skip. "Are you assuming something, Mr. Hawthorne?" Daniel's smile was mysterious. "Call it frontier intuition, or maybe just hope." Spring's arrival in March brought confirmation of Daniel's intuition. Sarah was indeed pregnant, due to deliver their first child in early autumn. The news transformed their planning from theoretical to urgent, as they realized how much preparation remained before becoming parents in such an isolated location. The first priority was medical care. While Sarah had considerable knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medical procedures, childbirth carried risks that required professional expertise. After extensive correspondence and negotiation, they arranged for Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a skilled physician and the Colonel's sister, to spend several months in the valley during the crucial period. "She's delivered dozens of babies throughout the territories," Daniel explained, as they prepared quarters for their extended guest. "Has more experience with frontier medicine than most doctors see in a lifetime." The second priority was education. If they were going to raise children in the valley, those children would need knowledge and skills that surpassed their parents' capabilities. Sarah threw herself into acquiring books, maps, scientific instruments, and other educational materials that would provide their offspring with opportunities equivalent to those available in established communities. "You're building a school," Dr. Morrison observed when she arrived in August, surveying the library Sarah had assembled. "I'm building a future," Sarah replied. "These children will inherit the valley someday. They need to be prepared for whatever challenges or opportunities that inheritance might bring." The doctor, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes, nodded approvingly. "Admirable. Too many frontier families neglect education in favor of immediate survival needs. Your child will have advantages most territorial children never receive. Margaret Elizabeth Hawthorne was born on September 15th, during the golden days of early autumn, when the valley glowed with changing leaves and the promise of abundant harvest. The delivery was difficult but successful, with Dr. Morrison's expert care ensuring the health of both mother and child. "Perfect," Daniel whispered as he held his daughter for the first time, his weathered hands gentle against her impossibly soft skin. "Absolutely perfect." Sarah watched her husband become a father, with emotions too complex for words. The man who had offered sanctuary to a desperate stranger had now created a new life with the woman who had accepted his generosity. The circle was complete in ways that transformed their partnership from personal happiness to family legacy. "She'll grow up here," Sarah said softly, looking around the cabin that had become their world. "This valley will be her first home, her playground, her schoolroom. She'll never know what it means to be homeless or hopeless." Dr. Morrison remained through October, teaching Sarah advanced medical techniques and ensuring that both mother and baby thrived during the crucial early weeks. Her presence also provided companionship during a period when Sarah might otherwise have felt isolated from female society. "You've built something remarkable here," the doctor said as she prepared to return to Fort Collins. "Not just the physical improvements, but the life you've created. This child will grow up with advantages that go far beyond material comfort." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, nursing baby Margaret while watching the season's first snowfall. "Outside the window, security," Dr. Morrison replied. "Not just physical safety, but emotional security. She'll know from her earliest memories that she's loved, wanted, protected. She'll see her parents working together as equals, solving problems through cooperation and mutual respect. Those are gifts that no amount of money can buy." After the doctor's departure, Sarah and Daniel settled into the rhythms of parenthood, with the same determination they had brought to every other challenge. Night feedings became opportunities for quiet conversation about plans and dreams. Daily baby care integrated seamlessly with the routines of homestead management. "She's strong," Daniel observed one evening as he watched Margaret grasp his finger with surprising force. "Good grip, alert eyes, healthy appetite. She'll do well in this environment." "She'll do well anywhere," Sarah corrected, "because she'll have the skills and confidence to adapt to whatever circumstances she faces. That's the real inheritance we're giving her, not just this valley, but the knowledge that she can succeed regardless of external conditions." As their first winter as a family deepened around them, Sarah reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years earlier, she had been a desperate woman with no options and no future. Now she was a wife, mother, successful businesswoman, and co-owner of a thriving frontier enterprise. The transformation still amazed her, not just in its completeness, but in its unexpectedness. She had never planned to become a frontier wife or business owner. Those identities had emerged from necessity and opportunity, revealing capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, finding her standing by the window with Margaret sleeping in her arms. "How different everything is from what I expected," Sarah replied. "When I boarded that freight wagon in St. Louis, I thought I was running away from life. Turns out I was running toward it." Daniel joined her at the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley that had become their kingdom. "Sometimes the best destinations are the ones we never planned to reach." Outside, the wind sang through the pines with the voice of winter, but inside their home, warmth and love created a sanctuary that no storm could touch. Baby Margaret slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that she was already inheriting a legacy of courage, determination, and partnership that would serve her throughout whatever adventures lay ahead. The Hidden Valley had completed its transformation from refuge to home, to birthplace of the next generation. And in the quiet moments of a winter evening, surrounded by the evidence of their shared achievements, Sarah Mitchell Hawthorne finally understood that some journeys end exactly where they were always meant to lead. Not to a destination, but to a beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.